Rarely does a film carry such a heavy burden before its first official release. And Snow White 2025 stands as a clear example of that phenomenon. Long before audiences could sit in a darkened theater and experience the story for themselves, the film had already become a target of intense public scrutiny. From casting announcements to early promotional images, reactions were swift, emotional, and often unforgiving. In many ways, the conversation surrounding the film had already solidified into judgment rather than curiosity. What should have been a discussion about narrative direction, artistic choices, or cinematic execution instead became a debate shaped by expectations, nostalgia, and cultural tension. By the time the film arrived, it was no longer simply a movie waiting to be seen, but a statement many believed they already understood. This kind of preemptive rejection is not new in modern cinema, yet it remains deeply problematic. A film, at its core, is meant to be evaluated through its storytelling, its emotional impact, and its ability to communicate ideas through character and craft. When an audience decides the verdict before the opening scene unfolds, the work itself is deprived of its most basic right: to be judged on what it actually is. In the case of Snow White, early criticism focused heavily on surface-level elements, particularly visual reinterpretations of an iconic character. These reactions, while understandable given the legacy involved, gradually overshadowed a far more important question. Could this film, regardless of its differences from the original, tell a story compelling enough to justify its existence? Disney's original Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs occupies a near-mythical position in film history. It is not only a beloved fairy tale but also a foundational piece of animation as an art form. Any attempt to revisit such a work is bound to invite comparison, and comparison often leaves little room for mercy. The live-action remake enters this space fully aware that it cannot replace the original, yet it must still prove that it offers something meaningful. This is where the film's challenge truly begins. When audiences focus exclusively on what has changed, they risk overlooking whether those changes serve a narrative purpose or simply provoke discomfort. At the same time, the filmmakers carry the responsibility of ensuring that reinvention does not come at the cost of coherence or emotional truth. What complicates matters further is the scale of the project itself. With a massive production budget and the weight of a global studio behind it, Snow White arrives with expectations of polish, clarity, and intention. A film of this magnitude cannot rely solely on spectacle or branding. It must earn its place through storytelling that resonates. In theory, controversy should not be fatal to a film. In fact, it can even generate curiosity. But controversy becomes destructive when it distracts from the work rather than invites engagement with it. For Snow White, the storm of early reactions created an environment where the film was forced to defend itself before it had the chance to speak. This leads to a critical observation. The true test for Snow White 2025 was never about whether it remained faithful to every detail of its predecessor, nor about whether it aligned perfectly with modern sensibilities. The real question was whether it could stand on its own as a well-told story. Could it create characters that feel emotionally grounded, conflicts that feel earned, and themes that emerge naturally rather than being imposed? When a film faces hostility before release, the margin for error becomes painfully small. Every weakness is amplified, while every strength struggles to be acknowledged. Under such conditions, even genuine efforts at storytelling risk being dismissed outright. Ultimately, Snow White entered the cinematic landscape already on trial, judged not for what it was, but for what many feared it might represent. This atmosphere shaped how the film would be received and discussed, often leaving little room for nuance. Whether the movie succeeds or fails on its own merits is a separate discussion. What remains undeniable is that it was never given a neutral starting point, and when a story is denied the chance to begin on equal ground, the question is no longer just about quality, but about whether audiences are still willing to let stories speak before deciding how they end. As the discussion moves beyond first impressions, Snow White 2025 increasingly positions itself within a familiar defense. It is, above all else, a film for children. This framing becomes central to how the movie is explained, justified, and, at times, protected from criticism. The argument is subtle but persistent. If the story feels straightforward, if the characters appear uncomplicated, if the emotions are expressed plainly rather than explored deeply, then perhaps that is not a flaw, but a deliberate choice. After all, the film is not aiming to challenge adult sensibilities. It is aiming to entertain families. On the surface, this logic seems fair. Alder 8, and then data. The Fort 8, and this says. Alder 8, and the says, and the say, and the says, and the say, and the says, and the says. Yet beneath it lies a tension that the film never fully resolves. Watching the film through the eyes of its youngest audience, it is easy to understand its appeal. The world is colorful and welcoming. The animals behave like gentle companions. The songs are melodic and easy to follow. The emotional cues are clear enough that children rarely feel lost. There is comfort in knowing who is good and who is not, in understanding what the story wants you to feel at any given moment. In a cinematic landscape, often crowded with noise and intensity, Snow White offers something soft and predictable. For many families, that alone may be enough. The film does not demand attention. It invites it gently. However, cinema has long demonstrated that accessibility does not require reduction. Some of the most beloved family films manage to speak in multiple registers at once. They allow children to enjoy the surface while offering adults emotional texture beneath it. In contrast, Snow White seems to commit fully to a single layer. Its storytelling is careful not to complicate its own message. Conflict is introduced clearly and resolved decisively. Moral lessons are spoken aloud rather than embedded within the narrative. The result is a film that feels safe, but also restrained. It chooses reassurance over curiosity, guidance over exploration. This choice becomes more noticeable as the film progresses. Scenes unfold with a sense of obligation rather than discovery. Each moment seems designed to lead directly into the next lesson, the next affirmation of values the audience is expected to absorb. While this approach ensures clarity, it also removes tension. There is little space for uncertainty, and without uncertainty, growth feels mechanical. Characters change because the story tells them to, not because the audience witnesses an internal struggle. For children, this may not register as a problem. For older viewers, it creates emotional distance. The story feels less lived in and more instructed. What complicates the matter further is the comparison the film itself invites. By revisiting a classic that has endured across generations, Snow White inevitably asks to be measured against a legacy of storytelling that has proven timeless precisely because it trusted its audience. The original tale, despite its simplicity, allowed silence, atmosphere, and visual emotion to carry meaning. In contrast, the remake often fills those spaces with explanation. It seems wary of ambiguity, as though unsure whether modern audiences, especially younger ones, are willing to sit with unresolved feeling. This caution may come from good intentions, but it also reveals a lack of confidence in the story's own power. There is also an unspoken risk in leaning too heavily on the label of children's entertainment. When simplicity becomes the default defense, it discourages meaningful critique. It suggests that asking for stronger character development or more nuanced storytelling is unreasonable. Yet children do not experience stories in isolation. They watch alongside adults. They revisit films as they grow. A story that offers depth reveals new meaning over time. One that does not often fades once its immediate charm wears off. In choosing simplicity without layering, Snow White limits its own lifespan in the cultural imagination. None of this means the film fails at its stated goal. It delivers a gentle fantasy that is unlikely to confuse or distress its intended audience. It offers moments of joy, warmth, and visual appeal. But the lingering question remains whether it could have achieved all of that while still daring to reach further. The history of family cinema suggests that it could have. The decision not to do so feels less like necessity and more like caution. And caution, while understandable, rarely creates stories that endure. In the end, Snow White 2025 leaves viewers with a choice. They can accept its simplicity as an appropriate boundary, or they can question whether that boundary was drawn too narrowly. The film invites comfort, but stops short of wonder. Whether that is enough depends on what one believes children's stories are capable of becoming when they are allowed to grow beyond their safest form. At the heart of Snow White 2025 lies a clear and deliberate ambition. This is not meant to be a simple reenactment of a familiar fairy tale. From its earliest narrative choices, the film signals its intention to reinterpret rather than replicate. The structure of the original story remains recognizable, yet the emphasis has shifted. This Snow White is no longer defined solely by innocence and endurance. She is repositioned as a figure of agency, responsibility, and moral leadership. On paper, this ambition is neither misguided nor unwelcome. Stories survive precisely because they are retold, reshaped, and re-examined through new lenses. The challenge, however, is not in changing a classic, but in understanding why those changes exist and whether they truly serve the story being told. The film retains the central conflict between Snow White and her stepmother, but reframes it around broader social concerns. The evil queen is no longer motivated only by jealousy of beauty. She becomes a symbol of greed and exploitation, obsessed with wealth and control rather than mere appearance. Her rule is portrayed as oppressive, her hunger for material power leaving the kingdom fractured and its people suffering. In response, Snow White is given a new burden. She is no longer simply a victim seeking refuge, but a young woman who must confront the consequences of leadership and injustice. The story asks her not only to survive, but to care, to act, and ultimately, to take responsibility for the world she has inherited. Alongside this transformation comes a significant revision of the romantic figure. The traditional prince, once defined by absence and idealized rescue, is replaced by Jonathan, a charming outlaw whose path intersects with Snow White's journey. This change is designed to introduce complexity and movement into the narrative. Instead of a single, symbolic gesture of love, the relationship is meant to unfold through shared struggle and choice. In theory, this allows romance to emerge organically, rather than function as a narrative shortcut. It also reflects a broader desire to modernize the story's emotional dynamics, replacing passive fate with mutual action. Yet ambition alone does not guarantee effectiveness. While these changes suggest depth, the film often struggles to translate intention into substance. The themes it introduces are undeniably larger than those of the original tale. but they are carried by characters who rarely feel equipped to embody them. Snow White is asked to represent compassion, courage, fairness, and resilience all at once. But the narrative rarely allows her to discover these qualities through failure or doubt. Instead, they are presented as attributes she already possesses, leaving little room for transformation. Growth is implied rather than experienced, which weakens the emotional payoff the story aims to achieve. The Evil Queen, despite being granted a more overt ideological role, faces a similar limitation. Her fixation on wealth and permanence is clearly articulated, yet repeatedly reinforced through dialogue, rather than revealed through evolving behavior. The film seems determined to ensure that her symbolism is understood, but in doing so, it reduces her to a concept rather than a character. The result is a conflict that feels intellectually defined but emotionally distant. The audience understands what the story wants to say, but rarely feels invited to interpret or question it. This tension between aspiration and execution defines much of the film's identity. It wants to honor the past while speaking to the present, yet it hesitates to fully trust either. The narrative frequently returns to familiar plot points to reassure itself. Even as it gestures toward reinvention, Snow White must still flee, still find refuge, still face the poisoned apple. These moments anchor the film in its legacy, but they also restrict its freedom. The story feels caught between reverence and reinvention, unable to commit fully to one without undermining the other. Rewriting a classic is an act that demands confidence. It requires faith that the new version can stand alongside its predecessor without leaning too heavily on it. In Snow White, 2025, the ambition is evident and, at times, admirable. The film clearly wants to say something relevant, to reshape an old myth for a changing world. But ambition without depth risks becoming surface-level transformation. The changes are visible, but their emotional roots remain shallow. In the end, the film's reinterpretation raises an important question. Is it enough to update the symbols of a story, or must the spirit evolve with equal care? Snow White attempts to modernize its narrative language, but often forgets that lasting stories are not defined by what they declare, but by what they allow audiences to feel and discover for themselves. As Snow White 2025 moves deeper into its narrative, a subtle imbalance begins to surface. The film grows increasingly focused on what it wants to say, rather than who is saying it. Themes, values, and moral conclusions step into the foreground, while the characters, meant to carry them, quietly recede. What remains is a story that feels guided by intention more than by emotion, where messages often arrive fully formed, leaving little room for the audience to engage with the characters as living, evolving individuals. At the center of this tension is Snow White herself. She is presented as a symbol of virtue, compassion, and moral clarity from the very beginning. Her kindness is unquestioned, her courage unquestionable, her sense of justice unwavering. These qualities are admirable, yet they are rarely tested in ways that feel personal or transformative. Instead of watching her struggle toward these ideals, the audience is repeatedly reminded that she already embodies them. Dialogue reinforces her goodness. Symbolic gestures underline her righteousness. The result is a character who feels less like a person discovering herself and more like a vessel designed to deliver a lesson. This approach extends to the film's use of visual and narrative symbolism. Objects and moments are assigned clear meanings, often explained rather than suggested. Virtues are named, intentions are spelled out, and conflicts are framed in unmistakable moral terms. While this clarity ensures that no viewer is left confused, it also removes the sense of discovery that gives stories emotional weight. When a film tells its audience exactly what to feel and why, it limits the power of empathy. The audience is guided, not invited. The supporting characters suffer from a similar constraint. Jonathan, positioned as a more modern counterpart to the traditional prince, is meant to embody growth, doubt, and eventual alignment with Snow White's values. Yet his motivations shift too abruptly, and his inner conflict is often stated rather than experienced. He speaks of ideals and resistance, but his actions do not always build toward a coherent emotional arc. Instead of witnessing gradual change shaped by consequence, the audience is asked to accept transformation as a narrative requirement. The message of shared purpose is present, but the relationship that should give it meaning remains underdeveloped. Even the evil queen, despite receiving expanded thematic significance, becomes trapped by the film's need to communicate rather than explore. Her obsession with wealth and permanence is emphasized repeatedly, framed as a clear contrast to Snow White's compassion. Yet this emphasis comes at the cost of complexity. Rather than allowing her desires to manifest through evolving choices and contradictions, the film reiterates her philosophy through explicit statements. She becomes less a character driven by fear or insecurity, and more an embodiment of an idea the film wishes to critique. The conflict, while conceptually clear, lacks the emotional unpredictability that makes villains compelling. This imbalance creates a curious viewing experience. The audience understands the film's values almost immediately, yet struggles to connect with its characters on a deeper level. Emotional moments arrive on schedule, but they rarely linger. The story feels constructed to deliver conclusions rather than journeys. In prioritizing clarity of message, the film sacrifices the ambiguity that allows characters to feel human. Real people are rarely defined by a single virtue or flaw. They hesitate, contradict themselves, and change in ways that are not always clean. Snow White avoids this messiness, opting instead for moral precision. There is also a broader implication at work. When films emphasize messages over characters, they risk reducing storytelling to instruction. Cinema, at its most powerful, communicates ideas through lived experience rather than declaration. It allows viewers to arrive at meaning through connection, not compliance. By contrast, Snow White, 2025, often feels as though it is guiding the audience toward a predetermined conclusion, rather than trusting the story to speak for itself. This does not mean the film's messages are misguided. The values it promotes are fundamentally positive and well-intentioned. Compassion, fairness, and courage are worth celebrating. The issue lies not in what the film believes, but in how it chooses to express those beliefs. When messages speak louder than characters, the story loses texture. It becomes smooth, polished, and emotionally distant. By the time the film reaches its later moments, the audience is left with a clear understanding of its moral stance, but a limited emotional attachment to the people who carried it. The story has spoken clearly, perhaps too clearly. In doing so, it reveals a central weakness. Meaning is most powerful when it emerges from character, not when it replaces it. Meaning, as Snow White 2025 reaches its conclusion, it becomes clear that the film's greatest struggle is not controversy, nor ambition, nor even execution in isolation. Its true obstacle is the shadow cast by its own legacy. From the moment it announces itself as a live-action reinterpretation of a foundational Disney classic, the film inherits expectations that are almost impossible to escape. It is not merely asked to be good. It is asked to justify why it exists at all, and, in attempting to answer that question, the film finds itself caught between reverence for the past and uncertainty about the future. The original Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs holds a unique place in cinematic history. It is not simply remembered as a story, but as a milestone, a moment when animation proved its emotional and artistic power. Its simplicity was never its weakness. It was its language. Emotion flowed through music, movement, and silence. Meaning was carried by atmosphere as much as by plot. Any remake stepping into this space must either transcend nostalgia or reinterpret it with clarity and confidence. Snow White, 2025, attempts to do both, and in doing so, accomplishes neither fully. Throughout the film, there is a visible hesitation. Familiar scenes are carefully recreated, as if to reassure audiences that the soul of the original remains intact. At the same time, new themes and modern sensibilities are layered on top, signaling that this is not merely a copy. The result is a story that constantly looks backward while trying to move forward. Iconic moments are revisited not because the narrative demands them, but because tradition expects them. Reinvention pauses just long enough to avoid alienation, then resumes cautiously. This rhythm creates a sense of restraint, as though the film is afraid to commit fully to its own identity. This fear is most evident in how the film resolves its central conflicts. Rather than allowing its reinterpretation to reshape the ending in a meaningful way, the story ultimately returns to familiar ground. The poisoned apple, the symbolic sacrifice, the restoration of order all unfold in ways that echo the original structure. While these moments provide recognition, they also underscore a missed opportunity. The film gestures toward evolution, but resolves itself through imitation. It acknowledges change, yet relies on legacy to close the narrative loop. The broader pattern reflects a challenge that has come to define many recent live-action remakes. They exist in a space where innovation is encouraged in theory, but constrained in practice. Studios promise bold reinterpretations, yet remain deeply dependent on nostalgia as a commercial anchor. In this environment, films often adopt the language of progress, while delivering stories that feel cautiously recycled. Snow White 2025 is not an exception to this trend. It becomes another example of a remake that borrows the weight of a classic without fully understanding how to escape its gravity. This does not mean the film lacks effort or intention. On the contrary, its creators clearly care about the story and the messages they wish to convey. But care alone does not guarantee resonance. A remake must do more than update appearances or adjust themes. It must rediscover why the story mattered in the first place, then rebuild that emotional core in a way that feels authentic to the present. In this case, the emotional through-line often feels secondary to the act of repositioning the narrative itself. By the time the credits roll, the film leaves behind a quiet sense of absence. It is not anger that lingers, nor outrage, but a feeling of unrealized potential. The story has spoken clearly, yet it has not echoed. The images are polished, the intentions visible, but the magic that once made the tale timeless remains just out of reach. The remake stands complete, yet unresolved, defined as much by what it avoids as by what it attempts. In the end, Snow White 2025 becomes a reminder of how difficult it is to revisit legends without becoming confined by them. The film does not fail because it changes too much, nor because it changes too little. It falters because it cannot fully let go of the past, nor fully claim a future of its own. Trapped between homage and reinvention, it remains suspended in the shadow of its legacy, a story retold, but not entirely reborn.